Before dawn, the Pacific sky carried a strange stillness, the kind that comes only after weeks of bombardment. Smoke still drifted above shattered palm trees, and the smell of salt mixed with burned fuel hung in the humid air. By the summer of 1945, Japanese defensive lines across the Pacific were collapsing under relentless American naval blockades, air raids, and amphibious assaults. Islands that had once been fortified outposts of the Imperial Army were now isolated pockets of exhaustion and hunger. Supply routes had been cut for months. American submarines had strangled shipping lanes. Food, medicine, and ammunition rarely arrived. On many islands, soldiers and civilian auxiliaries survived on diluted rice, foraged roots, and whatever fish could be caught in waters patrolled by enemy aircraft. Malaria and dysentery spread quietly through the ranks. For those stationed far from the Japanese mainland, surrender was not discussed openly, but starvation was. Among those trapped on one such island were several young Japanese women assigned as civilian support workers. Some had been nurses in training. Others worked as clerks or radio assistants. Officially, they were there to serve the empire. Unofficially, they were as frightened and isolated as the teenage conscripts digging defensive trenches along the beach. They had grown up in a society shaped by the values of loyalty, endurance, and honor. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors emphasized absolute obedience and the moral duty to avoid capture. Newspapers and wartime propaganda repeated the same warning: the enemy would show no mercy. Stories circulated of brutal treatment by Western forces, stories rarely verified, but repeated often enough to feel true. Capture, they were told, meant humiliation. For women, the fear was even sharper. By early morning, distant artillery thuds echoed across the hills. American forces were advancing inland. The defensive line, already weakened, had fractured during the night. Officers burned documents, radios fell silent. Orders became fragmented, shouted in confusion rather than delivered with discipline. Some soldiers prepared for final resistance, others quietly removed insignia from their uniforms. Inside a makeshift wooden shelter, the women sat close together in near darkness. The youngest among them, barely 19, clutched a small cloth pouch containing a family photograph and a charm from a Shinto shrine. She had not eaten a full meal in days. Her hands trembled, whether from hunger or fear, she could not tell. Outside, boots pounded against hardened earth. A rumor spread quickly. American troops had landed on the western ridge and were moving faster than expected. Someone whispered that prisoners taken on a neighboring island had been paraded, mocked, beaten. Another insisted that none had survived at all. No one knew what to believe. Information had become as scarce as food. As dawn approached, the sky shifted from black to deep indigo. One of the older women, who had once worked as a schoolteacher, tried to steady the group. She reminded them that panic would dishonor their families. Yet even she could not hide the uncertainty in her voice. They had been taught that surrender was shameful, but no lesson had prepared them for this moment. The officers who had promised protection were gone, moving toward the front or disappearing into the jungle. Then came the sound they had dreaded: voices speaking English, close enough to distinguish individual words. The crack of a rifle shot echoed once, then silence. A command was shouted in Japanese, not from one of their own, but someone with a heavy foreign accent. "Come out! Hands up!" Time seemed to stretch thin. The women looked at each other, searching for guidance in each other's faces. There was no dramatic last stand, no final patriotic speech, only the quiet understanding that the war, at least for them, had reached its breaking point. When they stepped outside, the rising sun revealed a scene both chaotic and strangely orderly. American Marines moved cautiously between damaged structures, weapons raised but controlled. Some soldiers barked instructions, others scanned rooftops and tree lines. The women expected shouting, perhaps violence. Instead, they were directed to sit together in an open clearing. A medic passed nearby, glancing briefly at one of them whose knees buckled from weakness. No one struck them, no one screamed. Yet the fear did not disappear. It settled deeper. What would happen next? Were they being gathered for interrogation, for punishment, or worse, for something they could not yet imagine? As the heat of the morning intensified, hunger gnawed harder than before. One woman whispered what the others were too afraid to voice. "If they feed us, will it be our last meal?" The question lingered in the heavy air. For them, surrender had always meant the end of honor, of identity, perhaps of life itself. Everything they believed about their enemy told them that mercy was unlikely. But the war had already begun to challenge every certainty they carried. And this was only the first morning in captivity. The first hours in captivity passed in a haze of heat and disbelief. The women sat in a small clearing, surrounded by coils of barbed wire hastily unrolled between wooden posts. Beyond the perimeter, American soldiers moved with controlled urgency, establishing what looked less like a prison and more like a temporary processing station. Crates were stacked, radios crackled, stretchers were carried past them toward a shaded area where the wounded, Japanese and American alike, were being treated. For the women, however, the barbed wire felt absolute. They had been instructed to sit in rows. Their hands were visible, resting on their knees. No ropes bound them, yet none dared to move. The discipline drilled into them since childhood held firm even now. Speak softly. Do not attract attention. Endure. Around them, other prisoners were gathered. Thin soldiers with hollow cheeks, a few older civilian laborers, even 2 teenage boys who looked no older than 16. Many kept their eyes lowered. A Japanese non-commissioned officer, now disarmed, stared at the ground as if trying to disappear into it. The shame of capture weighed visibly on him. In pre-war Japan, surrender was rarely portrayed as survival. It was presented as failure. The military code emphasized death before dishonor. On islands such as Saipan and Okinawa, there had been tragic instances of civilians taking their own lives rather than facing capture, driven by fear and propaganda that described Americans as merciless and cruel. The women knew these stories. They had heard them repeated in classrooms and community halls. Some had believed them completely. So when an American soldier approached carrying a metal canteen, every muscle in their bodies tightened. He stopped a few feet away and placed the canteen on the ground between them. Then he stepped back. No shouting, no mocking laughter, just a brief gesture of his hand indicating they could drink. For several seconds, no one moved. Finally, the oldest woman reached forward. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the canteen. She hesitated again, wondering if this was some kind of test, but thirst overpowered suspicion. She took a careful sip. It was only water, warm, metallic-tasting water, but clean. She passed it to the next woman. The simple act unsettled them more than cruelty might have. Kindness, however minimal, did not match the image they had been given of the enemy. As the sun climbed higher, the camp grew louder. Prisoners were counted, names attempted and mispronounced. An American officer consulted a clipboard, while an interpreter, likely a Nisei soldier, an American of Japanese descent, moved between groups translating instructions. The women exchanged uneasy glances when they heard Japanese spoken fluently by someone in an American uniform. It blurred the lines they had been taught were absolute. By afternoon, rations were distributed: hard crackers, canned meat, and small portions of fruit. The smell alone made their stomachs ache. Yet again, hesitation held them back. "What if they want us strong for questioning?" one whispered. "What if this is the last kindness before punishment?" another replied. Hunger battled pride, pride battled fear. Across the enclosure, a young Japanese private began eating immediately, barely chewing before swallowing. No one stopped him, no one struck him. An American guard simply watched, rifle slung but lowered. The women finally accepted their portions. The first bites were mechanical, almost numb. Salt from the canned meat burned their dry lips. The crackers crumbled into dust against their tongues. But it was real food, more substantial than anything they had eaten in weeks. As the evening approached, the tropical sky shifted into streaks of orange and violet. The camp quieted into a tense routine. Guards rotated positions. Lanterns were lit along the wire. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled faintly, a reminder that the war continued beyond this small perimeter. They were escorted to a wooden barracks, previously used for storage. It smelled of oil and damp wood, but it offered shade and a roof. Blankets were handed out, thin, army-issued, but clean. Inside, the women sat close together on the wooden floor. "This is not how I imagined it," the youngest admitted softly. No one answered at first, because none of them knew what to imagine now. They had prepared themselves for violence, for humiliation, for immediate suffering. Instead, they were met with structure, with restraint, with an unfamiliar kind of order. And that uncertainty created its own torment. If the enemy was not behaving like a monster, then what did that mean about everything they had been told, about the war itself, about the sacrifices already made? Outside, an American medic walked past the barracks, carrying a lantern and a medical kit. He paused briefly when he heard coughing from within. For a moment, his shadow lingered in the doorway. The women froze. Footsteps approached. One of them whispered into the darkness, barely audible over her own breathing. "Are they coming for us now?" No one slept easily that night. Every shift of boots on gravel sounded like a summons. Every murmur in English felt like a decision being made about their fate. They had crossed an invisible line that morning, from defenders of the empire to prisoners of the enemy. Yet the cruelty they expected had not arrived. And sometimes uncertainty is more frightening than fear itself. Morning arrived not with shouting, but with the unfamiliar scent of coffee drifting through the humid air. For a moment, none of the women moved. They had slept lightly on the wooden floor, wrapped in thin army blankets, waking at every distant footstep. The previous day's events still felt unreal. The capture, the water, the rations. They had expected violence. Instead, there had been procedure. Now there was something else. The smell was rich and bitter, cutting through the damp odor of the barracks. It was followed by another scent, eggs cooking in metal pans, and something like toasted bread. Their stomachs tightened instinctively. Hunger, sharpened by weeks of near starvation, returned with force. Outside, the American camp was already awake. Boots moved with rhythm. Metal clanged softly against metal. Voices spoke in low, efficient tones. There was no chaos now, only routine. A guard appeared at the doorway and gestured calmly for them to step outside. They obeyed without protest. The morning light revealed a small field kitchen set up near the wire perimeter. A portable stove hissed as grease popped in a pan. A line of American soldiers waited with metal trays. Nearby, a man with a Red Cross armband moved between stations, speaking briefly with the cook before checking on a wounded prisoner seated under shade. The women noticed him immediately. He did not carry a rifle, only a medical bag. His sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbow, exposing forearms marked with faint sunburn. He looked tired, not cruel, not triumphant, simply tired.
When he turned toward them, there was no hostility in his expression, only assessment. An interpreter approached and spoke gently in Japanese. "You will receive breakfast." The word itself felt foreign in this context. Breakfast was a civilian concept, a daily ritual of normal life. It did not belong inside barbed wire. The women exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "Why?" The interpreter hesitated, then replied, "Because you are prisoners of war. You must eat." The medic stepped forward, holding a tray. On it sat scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toasted bread, and a small tin cup filled with dark coffee. Steam rose visibly in the cool morning air. He crouched slightly, lowering himself so he would not tower over them, and extended the tray toward the oldest woman. For several seconds, she did not reach for it. Every lesson she had been taught echoed in her mind. The enemy deceives. The enemy humiliates. The enemy destroys. Was this food meant to mock them? To soften them before interrogation? To demonstrate dominance? The medic spoke quietly to the interpreter. "She looks weak. Make sure she drinks the coffee slowly." The words were translated. Not a threat, a concern. The woman's hands trembled as she accepted the tray. The metal felt warm against her palms. The eggs were pale yellow, slightly overcooked at the edges. The bread smelled of yeast and smoke. The coffee's bitterness lingered sharply in the air. She stared at the food as though it might vanish. Across from her, the youngest woman whispered the question that had haunted them since yesterday. "Is this our last meal?" No one answered. The medic, unaware of the exact words but sensing the tension, gave a small nod, not of authority but reassurance, and moved to prepare another tray. One by one, the women received their portions. At first, no one ate. They waited. For laughter, for punishment, for a hidden condition. Nothing happened. An American soldier nearby focused only on adjusting the stove flame. Another sipped his own coffee, glancing briefly toward the horizon. The silence stretched. Finally, the oldest woman lifted a forkful of eggs to her mouth. She paused again. Then she tasted it. Salt, warmth, real nourishment. Her body reacted before her pride could intervene. Tears filled her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the shock of something so ordinary feeling extraordinary. The others followed. The youngest tried the coffee and winced at the bitterness, but drank again anyway. The warmth spread through her chest, like something she had almost forgotten. Comfort. There was no humiliation, no cruelty, only breakfast. The medic returned after a few minutes, kneeling beside one of the women who coughed persistently. He checked her pulse with practiced efficiency, then examined her eyes for signs of dehydration. His touch was clinical, not invasive. He asked a few questions through the interpreter and scribbled notes onto a small pad. "Malnutrition," he muttered, "will increase her rations slowly." The women watched him carefully. This was not the enemy described in wartime leaflets. This man did not radiate hatred. He radiated fatigue and duty. The contrast unsettled them more deeply than violence might have. If he could treat them as patients instead of enemies, then what did that say about the world beyond this island? As the meal ended, trays were collected without ceremony. No one rushed them. No one insulted them. The medic gave one final glance to ensure they had eaten, then moved on to attend to an American soldier with a bandaged arm. For the first time since capture, the women felt something unfamiliar begin to replace raw fear. Confusion, and beneath it, cautiously, almost painfully, the smallest flicker of relief. The war was still raging beyond the wire. Nations were still locked in brutal conflict. But in this small clearing, under a rising Pacific sun, the morning had delivered not punishment, but eggs, toast, and coffee. And that simple reality challenged everything they thought they knew.
By the fourth day in captivity, the rhythm of the camp no longer felt chaotic. It felt structured, predictable. That predictability, more than anything else, began to wear down the women's rigid expectations. They were counted at sunrise, given water, assigned shaded areas to sit. The wounded were treated first, regardless of uniform. The American medic returned each morning, checking temperatures, examining infected cuts, distributing tablets for fever. He worked with quiet concentration, speaking only when necessary. For the women, the real struggle was no longer physical hunger, it was internal. From childhood, they had absorbed the ideals of loyalty and endurance. Surrender had been described as disgraceful, a permanent stain not only on the individual, but on the family name. During the war, newspapers and military instructors reinforced the belief that capture by Western forces meant brutality. To survive as a prisoner felt, in some ways, like a betrayal of those who had chosen death instead. Now they sat behind barbed wire, alive. One afternoon, the interpreter approached with unexpected news. The medic wanted to speak with them, not for interrogation, but to explain camp procedures. The women stiffened automatically, bracing for accusation. Instead, the medic removed his cap before addressing them, a small gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. Through translation, he explained that under international law, prisoners of war were to be given food, medical care, and protection from violence. He used the term Geneva Convention, unfamiliar to most of them. The interpreter struggled slightly to convey the legal concept in Japanese, but the meaning was clear. They were not to be harmed. One of the women, gathering courage, asked quietly, "Even if we were your enemy?" The medic listened carefully as the words were translated. His reply was brief. "You were soldiers, now you are prisoners. That is different." The distinction lingered in the air. For women raised on stories of uncompromising honor, the idea that an enemy could separate battlefield duty from personal cruelty felt almost impossible to process. It forced them to confront a question they had never considered. What if the war had simplified the enemy into something less human than reality allowed? Later that evening, one of the younger prisoners developed a high fever. In the past, illness on the island had often meant isolation and quiet death. Medicine had been scarce long before surrender. Now the medic arrived quickly when summoned. He examined her, mixed a powder into water, and remained nearby until her breathing steadied. He did not rush, he did not display superiority, he simply worked. The other women watched closely. Gratitude rose within them, unwanted, confusing. To feel thankful toward the enemy felt disloyal, yet to deny what they were witnessing felt dishonest. That night, as lantern light flickered against the wooden walls of the barracks, they spoke in hushed voices. "If our families knew," one began. "They would not understand," another finished. They wondered what had become of home. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka had suffered devastating air raids. Communication had collapsed months earlier. The empire that had promised protection now felt distant and silent. One woman, who had once been a school teacher, confessed something she had not dared say aloud before. "I thought surrender would mean the end of who I am, but I am still here." Her words carried weight. The war had taught them that identity was tied to sacrifice, even death. Yet here they were, breathing, thinking, questioning. Survival itself was beginning to reshape their understanding of honor. Outside the barracks, the medic sat on an overturned crate, writing notes by dim light. His own war was far from romantic. He had treated burns, amputations, infections that arrived too late for saving. He had seen young men from his hometown carried off stretchers and buried under foreign soil. Compassion was not softness, it was discipline. The women did not know his history, they only saw his actions.
The next morning, when breakfast was distributed, there was less hesitation. Hands still trembled slightly, but not from terror. One of the women even managed a quiet "thank you" in broken English as she accepted her tray. The medic paused, surprised, then nodded once in acknowledgement. It was a small exchange, barely noticeable to anyone else, but within that moment existed something larger than either side had expected, a recognition that even in total war, humanity could survive in fragments. The barbed wire remained, the guards remained, the uncertainty of the future remained. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The women no longer saw themselves standing at the edge of humiliation or death. They stood instead at the edge of understanding that honor might not lie solely in dying for one's country, but in enduring, in witnessing, and in remembering the complexity of those once called enemies. And that realization was far more unsettling than fear.
Weeks passed before the word reached the island. At first, it arrived as a rumor carried between guards, then as a radio transmission repeated twice for clarity. Finally, it was confirmed through the interpreter, who gathered the prisoners beneath the shade of a canvas awning and spoke with unsteady breath. Japan had announced its surrender. For a long moment, no one reacted. The women had imagined this possibility in abstract terms, but hearing it spoken aloud felt unreal. The empire that had shaped their childhood, their education, their understanding of duty, had laid down its arms. The war that had consumed oceans and continents was ending. One of the younger women began to cry quietly, not from shame, but from exhaustion. Another stared at the ground, whispering the emperor's name under her breath. Relief and grief collided in equal measure. For the American camp, the news triggered a different response. There were restrained celebrations, brief smiles, handshakes, a few relieved laughs. But the discipline remained. Guards still rotated, meals were still prepared, the medic still made his morning rounds. War might have ended on paper, its human consequences lingered. In the days that followed, preparations for repatriation began. Lists were compiled, names carefully recorded. The women were informed they would eventually be transported to a processing center before returning to Japan. The timeline was uncertain, but the direction was clear: home. Home. The word felt both comforting and terrifying. What awaited them there? Cities reduced to ash, families displaced, a society forced to confront defeat. Would they be welcomed as survivors or judged as those who had surrendered? On their final morning inside the camp, breakfast was served as usual: eggs, toast, coffee. The same simple meal that had once filled them with suspicion now felt symbolic of something else entirely: routine, stability, a small act repeated daily without cruelty. The medic moved down the line, checking a clipboard one last time. When he reached the group of women, he paused. Through the interpreter, he explained that they would be transferred by truck within the hour. He reminded them to drink water during the journey. He handed one of them a small packet of medical tablets, just in case. There was an awkward silence. Then the former school teacher stepped forward slightly. She bowed, not deeply, but deliberately. "Thank you," she said in careful English. The medic seemed unsure how to respond. Finally, he removed his cap again and gave a brief nod. "No more war," he replied softly. It was not a political statement, just a hope. As the truck carried them away from the island camp, the women looked back only once. The barbed wire appeared smaller from a distance, less like a prison, more like a temporary boundary in a moment of history. Years later, long after cities were rebuilt and families reunited, the memory of that first breakfast would remain sharper than the sound of artillery. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. In a time defined by destruction, they had expected cruelty and found procedure, expected humiliation and found restraint, expected a final meal and received simply another morning. Some would rarely speak of their captivity. Post-war Japan struggled with its own narratives of honor and responsibility. Survival stories did not always fit easily into public memory. Yet in private moments, they would remember the smell of coffee in humid air, the warmth of metal trays against trembling hands, the strange calm of a medic who treated enemy prisoners as patients. The war had taught them many things about loyalty, sacrifice, and loss. But that small clearing behind barbed wire had taught them something else, that even within vast conflict, individual choices still carried weight, that humanity was not erased by uniform alone. History would record dates, battles, treaties. They would remember breakfast.